Welcome to CyberJA, the place where we discuss all things cybersecurity and GRC. I am Richard Perry, your cybersecurity and GRC enthusiast. And in today's video presentation that I'll be sharing with you, I'll be looking at best practices or guidelines for conducting a cybersecurity risk assessment. And as cybersecurity professionals, we all know that conducting risk assessments or risk assessment is very critical in terms of identifying or selecting the most applicable security controls that we need to implement within our environments in order to mitigate or reduce the impact that potential threats may have on our environment. So let us look at these best practices that can guide you or aid you in that process of conducting your security risk assessment. Now let us first have an understanding of what a risk is. Right now, there are many definitions of cybersecurity risk. Hence, before we actually go further into the details of conducting a risk assessment, it is important for us to establish a common understanding or definition of cybersecurity risk. And for the purpose of this guideline, risk is defined as so according to the NIST SP 800, risk is defined as a function, risk is defined as a function of the likelihood of a given threat, the likelihood of a given threat event exercising on a vulnerability of an asset, and secondly, the resulting impact of the occurrence of the threat event. And each of the risk factors that I've just mentioned, I will be explaining for you to get a better understanding. So let us look at that quickly. All right. So the first element we look at is the threat event. The threat event. When we talk about the threat event, this refers to any event during which a threat actor, by means of the threat vector, acts against an asset in a manner that has a potential to cause harm. Now, in the context of cybersecurity, threat events can be characterized by the tactics or TTPs, so that tactics, techniques, and procedures employed by threat actors in order to carry out their various malicious attacks. Then the second element that we look at as it relates to risk is vulnerability. And when we talk about vulnerability, this refers to a weakness in the design, implementation, and operation of an asset or the internal control of a process. Then we have likelihood. These are all the elements as it relates to when you talk about risk. So likelihood, and likelihood refers to the probability that a given threat event is capable of exploiting a given vulnerability or a set of vulnerabilities, and the probability that can be derived based on factors namely discoverability, exploitability, and reproducibility. Then we have next element of when you talk about risk is impact, and impact refers to the magnitude of harm resulting from a threat event exploiting a vulnerability or a set of vulnerabilities. The magnitude of harm can be estimated from the perspective of a nation, organization, or individual. So now we have a better understanding of what a risk is. Then we want to look at what is a risk assessment. Right now, according to Wikipedia, a risk assessment, broadly speaking, is the combined effort of one, identifying and analyzing potential events that may negatively impact individuals, assets, and/or the environment, and making judgments on the tolerability of the risk on the basis of a risk analysis while considering influencing factors. Right? So that is what risk assessment refers to. And there are many other interpretations of risk assessment and risk. So with that understanding, let us now look at some of these best practices or guidelines that you can use to help you in the process of uh, conducting your cybersecurity risk assessment. And the first thing that we have key, very importantly, is to determine roles and responsibility in this process. Now, to ensure that the stakeholders are aware of their expected roles in a risk assessment exercise, it is important that you state them clearly upfront. So all persons within the organization understand their responsibilities. And these key roles in a risk assessment exercise may include persons such as the head of the organization, the business owner, risk management functions, technology and operation function, or department heads as it relates to these departments, cybersecurity function, right? So it's very critical that all these individuals, stakeholders within an organization understand their role in you as a professional executing or carrying out this risk assessment within the organization, so that they, with their buy-in, with their consensus, with their agreement, then this process will flow much easier as you seek to build or develop that, carry out an effective risk assessment. Now, next thing that you want to do in this process is to conduct a risk assessment survey. And in the risk assessment survey, then this is where you have input from management and department heads, becoming very vital to the risk assessment process. And this survey is an avenue to document specific risk or threats within these departments or each department that makes up the entire organization. Secondly, you want to identify risk, right? Identify a risk. And the purpose of a risk assessment, as mentioned before, is to evaluate something like an IT system and ask, what are the risks to hardware? What are the risks to software? What are the risks to data and IT personnel? What are the potential adverse events like fire, human error, bomb threats, flood? What's the potential for loss of integrity, the availability or confidentiality in your systems? All right. Secondly, our third best practice is to assess risk importance and risk likelihood. All right. So, what is the likelihood? And this is where you continuously ask those probing questions. What is the likelihood of a specific event having a negative impact on an asset? And this can be expressed subjectively or quantitatively as high, medium, low, or 1, 2, 3, depending on your rating scale. Fourthly, you want to create your risk management action plan, right? And in this risk management action plan, so based on your analysis of which assets are valuable and which threats are likely to negatively if affect those assets, you must develop control recommendations to either mitigate, transfer, accept, or avoid risk. Fifth and last is your implement, where you actually implement a risk management plan. Right? So now that you have completed the first 4 steps to a risk assessment, you have developed an effective way to identify and manage risk. Now it's time to train your team and implement those critical controls to mitigate or minimize the impact of the risks that have been identified. And for sure, it's a continuous process of assessment that you monitor this risk assessment to make adjustments where the needs arise accordingly. So this is not just a one-off activity, but it's a continuous process of monitoring the various risks in the environment and then applying the most applicable controls to mitigate the impact of the risks that have been identified. And with that said, we have now completed the best practices or guidelines that can help in risk assessment activity. And let me quickly share with you the application of a risk assessment matrix that you can develop to carry out this risk assessment activity in your organization. So there we have our risk assessment matrix. And within our risk assessment matrix, recognize we have asset characterization, we have threat identification, we have our vulnerability identification, then we have our control analysis, the likelihood determination, the impact analysis, risk determination, and we also have control recommendations and results. And from this, then you recognize that we have the asset identification, for example, hardware, software, resource, priority, data. And then from this, you can then determine the loss of integrity, availability, confidentiality. You can then assign those various ratings within your matrix. Okay, so with that said, then we would have covered these best practices or guidelines that can assist you as a cybersecurity professional in your risk assessment activities. So there we have it. Best practices or guidelines for conducting a cybersecurity risk assessment. All right, and as usual, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and turn on that notification bell for future updates. See you in future presentations.